attending CNI's Director of Representative in New York and works for UNRWA. Mr. Whitley, you have been talking about board member and full-time lecturer about when I was working in Jerusalem with solidarity conversation for many solidarity organizations, women in the territory, and producer of the film Graduation that supporting both can be found on the UNI's website, Jerusalem Population Project of the Council of Interest working for leaders that fair way in its proximity to the population or living in commentary for at real population. Andrew Whitley, Director of North American Representative Population for the United Nations amidst Israel's humanitarian crisis against the world and celebrating human rights in Algeria and Russia, Iran, and political detention in Syria, among other topics. Whitley has always served the United Nations Conference on Trade Development in Geneva as Secretary General's Office and the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, holding senior posts in UN Transitional Administration for Peace, War, and Control. Whitley previously worked as an academic in Tehran and New York and as a foreign correspondent specializing in the Middle East, South Asia, and Latin America with PhD and financial ties. He is the founding director of UNRWA, a now human rights watch in the Middle East and North America, and with ending on the show, particularly one day. Really, what the given that your work is a little bit about the work of Iraq, particularly the death toll of the Russian demonstration, and of course, much more than 100 U.S. people and we will be able to say I had heard that really or even a public to bring out information that the necessity of implementation of these resolutions that somehow outrank Mr. Whitley is on a personal level. So what is it like to work in an organization in the U.S. given that you are at the beginning arguably or one of the main obstacles to the implementation of resolutions in UN resolutions that would make your job easier or sometimes not even necessary or more likely to work in the U.S. and therefore about finding ways to make difference from the UK or other parts of the world to get the money to policy, one that will have a big impact on the ability of the population to be able to comment on it. We respond to that with U.S. military aid to Israel, and if we talk about how it's beneficial to the people, to be able to let your comments and get access to doctors or medical assistance. We appreciate that, obviously, as well, it does nicely that the United States has operations to access that information. We understand to lobby for Iran, probably using located innovations. We'd like to see some one that is success, otherwise early being ways to further and improve this process and bring about population reunification. And well, you've anticipated ambulation yourself. We always recommend in a very since operating should be moving housing to overall having the issues of what we try to do and living to destroying the elements of Israel's rights and other places while we rather than only bringing them back to regard extraordinary cases to that is the of the people that I have the privilege of being able to help organize a community has some of the legal maintained human being baskets of trials as outcry to the students which are in a strong right not really shame and tolerance program that will have any significant loss. Program that last refunded bilaterally by the youth to catch up windows that were really had strong resonance among the population. In addition, these hospitals seem to know visas of the abilities of the ability to be able to ask them to be private through a year ago during Operation Gaza, the most terrifying traumatizing capacity in Gaza was destroyed all around the lot. These people had outlets for urging and over 50,000 enjoyed their time here and went to Paris to Washington to New York. And I think that has been very clear to people who are really going to like to allow their values and values jointly by the community of the United Nations to respect by the Palestinian Authority and minimizing the overall by the United Nations starting point on their competition economically with Europe to bring them to their side. There's a sense of element for them that the United Nations unfortunately yes, which is very to deal with us and right effective to deliver repeated international services that demonstrate that we think one important factor is negotiation on the U.S. area for a large number of clearly starting which has demonstrated our deal breaker just with U.S. regulation. Secondly, we think that an organization has been repeated engineers and refugee situations anywhere in the world to need that we have those families themselves very well in discussions about their own families and the refugees need to know what their options are often unactively. Obviously what we are to do is change today's terms and to understand we will support the real homes in that area not able to do what we would like small amounts of doing in Gaza today by some only through starting a dialogue with the people. Secondly, we've had difficulty getting for example exercise under one major center at the moment operating in Gaza. That demand would not be controversial to ensure that we're able to get a viable solution. And that's because of the current restrictions people most especially are taken around textbooks. We certainly would like to be able to upgrade to an educational program share one single. We need additional funds to be able to more difficult summer game program in Gaza to provide schools like our operating social education has become hardly enough ability to have failures into support regular programs rather but overall we think that U.S. funds are used pretty well and adaptively have not been available and we've not been able to bring them in. There's a long and rather perverse list
really, even of the Palestinian people. Oftentimes this is seen as something that the international community with Israel and with the U.S. commercial will come back and somehow giving no real agency or power to the Palestinians themselves.
Today with Andrew Whitley, Director of the North American Representative Office in New York for UNRWA,
I totally agree with you on the importance of their real ownership in their
Mr. Whitley, you had been talking a bit about the obstacles posed by the blockade on UNRWA's work in especially the Gaza Strip. Can you give us some more examples?
I'd conclude with 2 points, Anna. One is that we as UNRWA, which operates a large number of schools and clinics and warehouses for food distribution inside Gaza, many of which were damaged during Operation Cast Lead, have been unable even to repair or to rebuild our own facilities. This is quite tragic that we are not able to do so to deliver our mandate in what remains, as we should recognize, occupied territory, and it's the obligation under international law of the occupying power, in this case Israel, to be able to facilitate the well-being of the population. So that's point one. Secondly, a number of major rehousing and rebuilding projects, reconstruction projects that we had started 4 years ago and were frozen because of the impact of the blockade even before Operation Cast Lead, have not been able to proceed. Some of these projects are 80-90% completed. They're new schools, a new vocational training center in Khan Yunis in the middle area of Gaza, where the donor money is certainly available and is frozen. But because of the lack of cement or other building materials, we've sadly not been able to finish them off and improve the conditions for the population. So I think these are quite telling examples of the way in which the blockade is having a very perverse, indeed cruel effect on the population as a whole.
Is UNRWA able to take public stances on these sorts of political issues in terms of ending the occupation, particularly the blockade? It's really interesting to me, given that your work is through the United Nations, which has passed so many dozens of resolutions condemning Israel's treatment of Palestinians, and of course it would be much more than 100 without the U.S. veto that oftentimes stifles these kinds of resolutions, especially in the Security Council, and most of these resolutions have been ignored. I have heard that really enforcement or even a public clear stance on the implementation, the necessity of the implementation of these resolutions is somehow out of UNRWA's mandate. Is that true? And if so, why is that? How can an organization through the UN remain divorced from UN resolutions?
Well, obviously we're not divorced from UN resolutions. We are part of the UN family. But it's important to note for listeners that we are not a political organization. We're a humanitarian organization, and we must respect the lines that imposes on us. At the same time, as UN officials, we cannot ignore the principles of the United Nations when we go about our work, and that includes speaking up for basic human rights. That includes the basic rights of the refugees who should not be treated in any way differently from any other person entitled to the same basic services and human needs that any other person should do. We are not an advocacy organization, and while we speak out about the effects of the injustice of the blockade, we are not there as a championing organization. We leave that to other parts of the UN system to do so. But at the same time, we think we have a responsibility to draw attention to the, what I call, perverse effects of the blockade, which we think is a counterproductive policy, and that leads to the political results of strengthening of Hamas's control of the territory, which appears to be counter to the stated, declared interests of Israel and the United States and other countries that are supporting that policy. And we are simply dealing with the consequences of it and trying to find ways of getting around an extremely negative policy that affects the population as a whole. But you speak about the need for enforcement of resolutions. It's member states that enforce resolutions rather than parts of the UN that are actually doing the work on the ground. It's the political will in New York, in the General Assembly and in the Security Council that has to be mustered to be able to do it. And we certainly urge members of the Security Council privately to be able to live up to their obligations and indeed to go and see for themselves, to send a delegation out there to be able to look on the ground, make an on-the-ground inspection tour, to be able to see how their resolutions are being overlooked or are not being fully implemented. The most recent of which was Resolution 1860 that was passed in January last year, immediately after the war, in order to be able to ensure that the humanitarian needs of the population are being met. At the most recent meeting of the Security Council just a few days ago, sadly, most member states were wringing their hands and saying, we regret that it hasn't done so far. And that comes down again to that ephemeral quality political will to make sure it happens.
What do you think would be necessary for things to change? Do you advocate the intervention of member states of the UN? What do you see as the possibility, hopefully if you see that there is any possibility, of changing the situation, the political situation?
Well, obviously, everyone recognizes that the United States is the most important political actor in this region. It needs to be brought to the attention of the Obama administration that the continuation of the blockade is one that is not necessarily in its own interest of being able to further an inclusive peace process that can bring about ultimately an end to occupation and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, which everyone is agreed we should be aiming towards. The way in which the blockade, by forcing the Gazans to be ingenious and rely on tunnels through Egypt, tunnels which Hamas is taking control over, to be able to tax it and to be able to authorize who is able to operate those tunnels and who is not, is having the effect of deepening the political divisions within the Palestinian political entities rather than actually bringing them back together again. And we feel that being the case, clearly it makes life more difficult for the overall ultimate goal of being able to have a single Palestinian territory that could achieve its independence.
My last question before we take the break, given your endorsement of a two-state solution, and of course that is the general UN proposed solution, at the same time, given the vast majority of people in Gaza are refugees from 1948 when they were expelled, often violently, from their homes and lands in order to create Israel as a Jewish state, in order to create a Jewish majority in a place where the majority of people were Muslim or Christian. Even if there were an end to the Israeli-Egyptian blockade, given the sheer size of the Gaza Strip and the sheer, enormity of the population itself, do you believe that there would be the even ability for a real resolution of the situation and the problems facing Gazans without the implementation of UN Resolution 194, which affirms year after year the right of Palestinian refugees, like any refugee, to return to their homes and lands if they are willing to live at peace with their neighbors?
Our starting point on this question is the importance of being able to put the refugee issue back onto the discussion agenda for the political actors. Unfortunately, it's usually been put into the too difficult to deal with basket right at the end of the issues as being something that the negotiators put off. We think it's important at an early stage of the negotiations to be able to address the refugee issue clearly as being a potential deal breaker if it isn't dealt with. Secondly, the very important principle which is applied in protracted refugee situations anywhere in the world of the need to be able to include the people themselves in the discussions about their own future, that the refugees need to know what their options are, whether it's to stay exactly where they are, get returned to present-day Israel, to their homes in that area, if that is an option that's on the table, or to get resettled elsewhere. But only through starting a dialogue with the people most concerned so that they can exercise their own informed consent, and I stress the word informed, that is the best way to be able to ensure that ultimately we'll get a durable solution and not one in which the people most affected are either taken for granted or else a decision is made over their heads. Those are the starting principled points. At the same time, you rightly point to the very difficult conditions in Gaza, a small, overcrowded territory lacking natural resources, hardly enough water, hardly enough ability to be able to support itself through agriculture or fishing.
Thank you for that answer, and I'm glad to get some clarity on that point. I certainly agree that without the involvement, really, even of the Palestinian people, oftentimes this is seen as something that the international community, with Israel and with the U.S., has to resolve, and somehow giving no real agency or power to the Palestinians themselves, the refugees for whom this matters most. Oftentimes they're left out, and I totally agree with you on the importance of their real ownership in their destiny. You are listening to CNI Jerusalem Calling. I'm your host, Anna Baltzer. Today we're speaking with Anna Baltzer, Director of the North American Representative Office in New York for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. We have a caller who's been on the line for a while. Thanks for waiting, David. We're talking to David from Spencer, West Virginia. You're on the air.
One question is, does UNRWA work for any other displaced groups? Does UNRWA need or accept donations? And what would be the best way for someone who wanted to help the Palestinian people to do so?
First of all, no, we have a geographically limited mandate, one that deals only with the people from former British Mandate Palestine. And here you give me a chance to add that it's not just people who are ethnically Palestinian. We deal with all the people who were displaced from Palestine in 1948 and then again in 1967 after the war that year. So that means that we also have Armenians, we have Circassians, other Turks, people from the former Ottoman Empire, even Jews in the original days of the agency. At one stage, we were looking after 50,000 displaced Jewish people, but always within that geographically limited area of former British Mandate Palestine and the surrounding territories. So the short answer is no. We don't deal with other displaced groups outside the region in which we operate, but we do deal with those people who meet our criteria of those who had been resident in British Mandate Palestine for 2 years prior to the 48 war and who lost both their homes and their means of livelihood. They have to prove both of those things, and that's quite a high standard in order to be able to qualify for assistance from us. On your point about donations, yes, we would welcome that. As a U.S. taxpayer, probably the best channel for you would be to work through the American Friends of UNRWA, which is a 501c3 registered organization based in Washington. They have a website. If you just Google American Friends of UNRWA, you'll be able to find them, and I know that they'd be very glad to be able to take any assistance, however small it might be, because we are a voluntarily funded agency. We have to raise every penny every single year, and your money certainly is needed.
Thank you, David, for being with us. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Whitley, on a personal level, what is it like for you working on this issue in the United States, given that the U.S. has been arguably the main or one of the main obstacles to the implementation of certain resolutions, UN resolutions, that would make your job easier or sometimes not even necessary? What's that like for you working in the U.S.? I imagine the climate here is quite different from the U.K. or in other parts of the world.
Well, it is self-evidently a highly politicized issue, a very polemical one with people with very strong views on both sides of the question. But here I must say that successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican administrations, have always been supportive of the agency. The United States is our largest single bilateral donor, and one which gave us in total last year $260 million. That's a really impressive sum of money. It was about a quarter of our total receipts under our different budget lines. The U.S., particularly the administration, has always been a very strong and reliable supporter for the organization. At the same time, we've faced opposition. I won't disguise that. There are those, particularly the strongly pro-Israel groups, which have sometimes seen us as a thorn in the side of Israel, is the way they would like to put it, or sometimes we're accused of perpetuating the refugee problem, a charge which we think is inaccurate and unfair. So there's a great deal of explaining to do, trying to explain to people what the limitations are for our mandate, and to explain to people that actually we're part of the solution, we're not part of the problem. We're helping people to stand on their own feet, giving them better choices in life, being able to mute or dampen down the radicalization of the population, which would otherwise occur if we weren't around.
Speaking about the money that the United States government has given to UNRWA to continue its work, I want to point out that, of course, the State Department recently announced they will be contributing $40 million to support core UNRWA services in Syria, Lebanon, the West Bank, Gaza, and including $10 million, which was allocated to support UNRWA's emergency appeal for the West Bank and Gaza, including emergency food assistance, job creation programs. What's interesting to me is at the same time we have committed to give Israel what amounts to about $30 billion over the next 10 years, much of it in military aid to help maintain many of the institutions that prevent Palestinians from being able to get their own food or in their own living. Does the simultaneous support of UNRWA and also of Israel's continuing imposition onto Palestinian lives, for example, with the blockade, does it sort of strike you as ironic or counterproductive even?
Well, I don't think it's our place to be able to comment on or criticize U.S. military aid to Israel. That would be inappropriate for me as a UN official to be able to do so. But I'll let your points stand for themselves. Certainly for us, we appreciate that the United States has always helped us to try to deal with the practical operational difficulties that we face. We understand that the State Department does lobby quite strongly for the easing of the blockade of Gaza, and we'd like to see some results from that, because otherwise the burden continues to fall on us in a way that we think is inappropriate and unfair. The population really should be allowed to stand on its own feet. This is a population in Gaza that is perfectly capable of being able to support itself, has historically been a very entrepreneurial population with strong, close economic links to Israel. We think those should be reestablished. We shouldn't be in the business of maintaining long-term emergency humanitarian aid. We should be moving quickly towards reconstruction and development, as we had tried to do in 2005, immediately after Israel's disengagement and withdrawal from Gaza.
I've had a similar observations myself. I think a common perception of Palestinians is either they're terrorists or they're simply pathetic victims, that they somehow are incapable of doing the most basic things, not only because of what Israel does, but also somehow that they are not an educated or capable, competent population. And this could not be further from the truth in my experience, that Palestinians, along with Israelis as well, remain among the best educated people in the entire Middle East, that we're talking about teachers and doctors and lawyers and some of the best educated people I've ever met, given their obstacles, a high percentage of people with PhDs as well. So I think it's crucial that people realize that of course the situation is not simply to aid these people, that if they were in a situation where they actually could get to work and they could earn a living, that they would be perfectly capable of doing so. And really the tragedy that organizations like UNRWA are needed to do the most basic things that Palestinians really are entirely capable of doing on their own. Given the U.S. support of the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, and then our simultaneous donations to or money given to UNRWA, do you feel like the money given to UNRWA by the U.S. is able to be used to the most efficient ability?
The answer is largely yes. We think that we're a very efficient, cost-effective deliverer of services, and repeated international surveys have demonstrated that. We just had a long investigation from the USGAO, the Government Accountability Office, which has demonstrated our full compliance with U.S. legislation. And so we think that as an organization that's been repeatedly scrutinized and examined by outside bodies, that we have come out pretty well from those evaluations. Yes, we can largely use the money effectively. Obviously, what we can't do is change the circumstances under which we work. It's very unfortunate that we're not able to do what we would like to be able to do in Gaza today in terms of development of people's skills through a new vocational training center, for example. There's only one major center at the moment operating in Gaza, and the demand for places is 10 times what we're able to provide to them. And that's because of the current restrictions on goods coming into the territory. We certainly would like to be able to upgrade our educational programs. We need additional funds to be able to support our summer games program, which provides some fun and light relief and a little bit of cultural education for Gazans. That's over and above our normal regular program. But overall, we think that U.S. funds are used pretty well and effectively.
You are listening to CNI Jerusalem Calling. I'm your host, Anna Baltzer. Today we're excited to be speaking with Andrew Whitley, Director of the North American Representative Office in New York for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Mr. Whitley, when I was working in Palestine, I worked for a solidarity organization, and there's, of course, many solidarity organizations on the ground participating in documenting the situation and supporting the Palestinian-led nonviolent resistance movement, with which I've worked a lot with. And then, of course, to complement that, there are aid organizations sustaining the population, keeping them oftentimes alive. There are people who would say that aid in itself, either perpetuating or let's say accommodates for Israel's lack of taking care of the occupied population, as it is supposed to do. An occupying power is required to take care of its occupied population. What would you say to the criticism that UNRWA is actually accommodating Israel's actions rather than making it accelerating the way towards change in Israel's action?
The criticism is valid. It's one that I've heard a number of times in the past. It's one that we hear quite frequently and under different circumstances. Even donor governments sometimes raise these questions about whether they should be rebuilding structures that have been destroyed by the IDF, for example, during military operations. And it's a hard one because there is no easy answer to it. And we need to throw the question back to those who ask the question, say, what do you think should be the alternative if Israel declines to fulfill its obligations? We all know what is legally the correct situation and what's the obligations. We recognize that formally it is Israel's responsibility as the occupying power to be able to take care of the basic needs of the population. It's also Israel's obligation not to be able to move settlers into occupied territory, to change the social composition and character of the territory, which it's continued to do for over 40 years. Since 1967, thus changing the possibilities of being able to bring about a negotiated settlement and protecting the rights of the people living in the occupied territories. That's all fine and good. That's the formal legal situation. But for a humanitarian organization, we face these dilemmas everywhere in the world, and we simply can't walk away from our obligations because it's the people themselves who are going to suffer if we do refuse to accept our responsibilities.
I've always wanted to ask UNRWA that question. So we had been talking before about the U.S. administration's role, both in giving money to UNRWA and giving money to Israel. Of course, the diplomatic role the United States plays in the United Nations and the development of this issue. I wanted to ask specifically about the Obama administration. President Obama has now been in office for more than a year. What is your perception of the Obama administration's handling of the so-called peace process in Israel-Palestine so far?
We know that they're serious about getting a solution. We recognize and accept that Senator Mitchell is very determined to try to bring about a solution, and the President himself has acknowledged publicly that there have been setbacks and things have not advanced as quickly as he would like to have done. But I'm certainly not going to get into any public commentary on the tactics that the United States has adopted. We simply recognize that U.S. engagement is crucial, and it's important to be able to win the confidences of all the parties. And at the same time, it has to deal with the most immediate situations, whether they're challenges that might come from acts of terrorism or the challenges from the blockade, or the closures in the West Bank with all the barriers to movement. These are things which obviously complicate the overall picture, and they're ones that the U.S. has to deal with in its relationship with Israel and with the Palestinian Authority, at the same time as trying to keep its eye on the ball of the long-term goal of being able to bring about an end to the occupation, which surely is in all of our interests to be able to do, to ensure that the poison is taken from this particular wound. So we can commend the U.S. for its efforts and its seriousness. We obviously would be interested in seeing the refugee question being part of the overall equation that is dealt with.
We have a caller on the line, Jim from New York City. Jim, you're on the air.
Thank you so very much for taking my call. I was one of the ones who was privileged enough to go on the CNI Spring 2009 political pilgrimage to the Middle East. And we had some wonderful UN hosts in Gaza who took us through everything. We had many good meetings with them and the people they introduced us to. And one of the things they had told us, one of their points of frustration was that it was becoming very hard in terms of their educational efforts to keep the students in not a civil mode, but to teach them peaceful values and not let them be tempted into jihadi type things. But they were saying that there was increased competition from, shall we say, extreme groups to influence the children otherwise, both through educational endeavors and, I guess, other pursuits. The UNRWA's comment to us was that the longer the blockade continues, the harder this kind of fight for the political will of the children is to achieve. And I just wondered if you could comment on how that's going.
I'm glad that you were able to go yourself. We always recommend that concerned people should, wherever possible, try and see for themselves and draw their own conclusions from talking to people on the ground. The observations you came away with are absolutely correct. It is increasingly hard to be able to give hope to young people of an end to the blockade, an end to occupation, and a sense of a better life for themselves. But I'm always struck myself, and I've lived in Gaza for 3 years, by the extraordinary resilience and decency of the people there. I've just had the privilege of being able to help organize a trip by some 30 15-year-olds and ninth graders from our classes, a group of boys and a group of girls, who came to the United States as their prize for being the top students, our stars, if you like, in a human rights, conflict resolution, and tolerance program that we run in all of our schools, a program, I should add, that's funded bilaterally by the United States government and has really had strong resonance among the population there. These kids were just wonderful ambassadors for Gaza. They were not embittered by their experience, although you would expect them to be, given what they went through a year ago during Operation Cast Lead, with the most terrifying traumas, seeing friends and relatives being killed and buildings destroyed all around them. They were people who had hopes for a better future, who enjoyed their time here in the States. They went to Atlanta, to the Carter Center, to Washington, and to New York. And I think that they came back as people who are really going to be able to allow their values and the values of the international community of the United Nations to spread a little bit further. I'm not disguising the overall problems that they face there, and indeed there is competition from extremist groups who would like to be able to bring them to their side. And there's a sense of nihilism and alienation among yet many young people.
Thank you, Mr. Whitley, so much for being with us. Mr. Andrew Whitley, Director of the North American Representative Office in New York for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. I'm your host, Anna Baltzer. This is CNI, Jerusalem Calling. Thanks so much for being with us. Jerusalem Calling. Thanks so much for being with us. Jerusalem Calling. Thanks so much.